Thanks, everyone. I want to start by thanking Teresita for her vision to put this together on the Ford Foundation for facilitating the conversation, and also want to shout out the incredible wisdom in the room. There's so much talent here, and I can't wait for the one-to-ones to actually be able to get to know and learn from each other. I'm an anthropologist who has worked on Latino cultural politics, and I want to start by addressing larger patterns that I've observed in regards to the problem of Latinx representation. And this is the cultural amnesia that surrounds anything Latino, what many have termed the Columbizing effect, where we find ourselves discovering Latino culture whenever there's a breakthrough artist, production, musical hit, or whatever it is that forces us to grapple with the impact and popularity of Latinos across mainstream culture. Think here of Ricky Martin, J-Lo, or Hamilton musical. At these moments of boom, we marvel at Latinos' growing demographics, celebrate the ingenuity of those cultural icons, but we quickly see how they're mainstreamed as American stories that do not threaten the larger Kool-Aid of assimilation. As if to qualm any claim that Latino culture could ever effectively transform or have anything valuable of its own to contribute to US culture. And here, I could go on at length about how many breakthrough Latino artists, icons, and whatever it is that get this kind of attention are already products of mainstreaming processes that render them more acceptable and palatable. But I'll leave this point for another conversation. The issue here is how to theorize the consistent invisibility of a population whose presence in the US predates the very founding of this country, but who remain invisible and unrecognized. Consequently, whenever anything identifiable Latino attains center stage, this visibility is seen as hyper-visibility, offensive, threatening, something to be explained away, rather than an indication of a vibrant Latino presence in North American culture. Racism has a lot to do with this. In particular, the racist foundation of the US national identity, predicated on a strict white and black binary, which remains the core axis for defining American identity. In this context, whiteness remains the unquestionable norm, while blackness is historically marginalized and denied of invention and artistry, but still irrefutably recognized as American. In contrast, identities falling beyond the binary are suspected as forever foreigner. The racialization of the immigration debate as a Latino issue further hones in the suspicion of foreignness when it repeatedly equates Latinos with immigrants, when all indications state that in fact Asians are the largest growing immigrant group in this country, and when undocumented immigrants hail from all nationalities. Racism also informs the packaging and containing of difference. We folklorize Latinx identity into stereotypes and consumable difference that can be easily identified. Some of those stereotypes have been mentioned today. Speaking Spanish or speaking with a Spanish accent, looking not too white or not too brown, and zillion other maneuvers that keep Latino culture in check, authentic, more commodifiable, but separate and distinct from US culture. The result are disavowals of Latinx in their richness and their erasure from spaces that are not stereotypically recognized as Latino. This summer, we saw one example in the Bronx when Bronx Latinos were reminded that they remain so invisible that they can be easily bypassed by art fairs organized in the very boroughs where they make a demographic majority. I'm speaking of the no-commission Contemporary Art Fair, the first contemporary art fair organized in the Bronx by hip-hop artist and producer Sweet Beats, who is a collector of his own, which included not one single artist, Latino artist, in the list of over 30 artists, to the great upset of the New York City Latinx arts community. In this way, we can't imagine and fully grasp the complexity of Latino art. We're blinded by the dominant Kool-Aid of American art, where Latinos are seen as foreigners, not an intrinsic part, and by the stereotypes about what makes authentic Latino culture, which makes it impossible to appreciate all of its components, Afro-Latinidad, the cultural production and artistry of urban contemporary Latinos in the Bronx, falls through the crack, as so do many other aspects of contemporary Latinos, Latinos who speak indigenous languages, as was mentioned earlier. Contemporary art provides a special instance where Latinos remain impossible to conceptualize and imagine. Art and aesthetics, after all, are spaces fueled by their own set of blinders, where matters of identity, race, and history are supposedly irrelevant or secondary. So thinking of Latino art already compromises its validity. Categories like Latin American art at least have gained some legitimacy in the art history roster, but Latino art, what is that? I think of the ghetto. I think of Washington Heights or the Bronx, is how one Latin American art dealer I spoke to put it. In the few minutes I have left, I want to address how this perception affects the art market and Latino artists' inability to access the market and be recognized as valuable. This exclusion is one of the most significant erasures, not only because of the centrality of the art market in our current neoliberal economy, but also because this exclusion impacts artists' lives, their economic well-being, and the evaluation of generations of artists onto the future. It stifles any impetus for collectors, institutions, and stakeholders to invest in our artists, relegating Latinx art collection to a matter of, quote, love and rescue, as anthropologist Arlene Dávila once put it. She notes that if it wasn't because for generations, a politics of love and rescue has been guiding Latino artists, communities, activists, and friends and family to acquire Chicano and Latino art to support our artists and rescue our visual tradition, there wouldn't be any visual art archives or collections from which curators could now turn to fill in the void in their collections. Latin American artists count with institutional backers in the form of the country's national elites, their embassies keen on investing in their artists. The development of Latin American auctions in Sotheby's and Christie's and now Phillips respond to the interest in Latin American art, of which Latin American elites and patrons have been consistent players. While still lagging behind the booming category of the art market, contemporary art market, the Latin American art market has decades of legitimacy and a track record for evaluating artists, providing an institutional foundation that increasingly attracts international collectors. And we saw how this by Adriana, how this also fits in academia. It's also fit in that category. In contrast, Latino art and artists have historically lacked patrons, while their general omission from the art market results in a void of data about the value of these artists that makes it impossible to be priced. This represents a circular and self-perpetuating problem. Lack of access to markets hinders the evaluation of the work of these artists and hence their future ability to enter the market. The result is that even some of our most canonical artists who were foundational in the Chicano and Nuyorican art movement in the late 60s and 70s lack a market and are impossible to be priced. Most of this work has never been bought or sold, and this alone taps their value and hinders their evaluation. Even artists who have been collected by important national museums face this problem of evaluation, and this is one of the reasons why museums and not-for-profit cultural institutions play such an important role in promoting Latinx art, because these institutions have historically played a determinant role in legitimating the work of artists who are otherwise shut out of other means of evaluation. Latinx art is complex and diverse, but work with strong political content is not uncommon, and this too presents another challenge. Many of our artists produce work that is not market-driven, and consequently are paying the price because, as someone put it, who would like to live with work that is so politically driven in their home or would make them uncomfortable? Then there's the racist and Eurocentric ideas of universality that impact our own identification as Latino because it's seen as immediately compromise the quality, artistry, and universality of our work. I bring to mind a conversation with a Latin American art dealer who participates amply on Latin American art fairs, who nevertheless, and has admitted profiting from the booming interest in Latin American art, who nevertheless qualified that he didn't want to ghettoize his work, that this was just a rubric he used, but he didn't really feel comfortable narrowing his work. What I found is that even within the Latino and Latin American art spaces, there's a lot of tiptoeing around identifying or embracing any identity as Latino, American artists, which is perhaps the greatest indication of the whiteness in the art market and the immediate devaluation of any artist that cannot come across as unmarked and hence white. Even most Latin American artists don't want to be identified as such because it compromises their ability to enter the wide world of contemporary art markets. This is so even when most Latin American art dealers recognize that this label and the institutional structures in place to promote this art has served them as a key platform for the evaluation of these artists in the first place. A clear pattern is that if any identity is to be claimed, it better be the more appreciated category of Latin American art, never that of a Latino. Hence, one pattern that I witness is that Latino artists who do better are those who often have links and connections with their home countries, and as a result could pass or could be recognized or identified as Latin American, not only as Latino artists. The representation of Carmen Herrera is a good example. Even though she's lived in the States for over 50 years, she's always described as Cuban-born, never as a Latina. Yes, some artists have roots and connections with their home countries, yet at the root of the Latinx identity is the neither here or there effect that distinguishes Latinx from Latin Americans. The fact is that many, if not most, Latino artists are also shunned from their heritage countries. I'm thinking of the many New Yorker artists who have never been invited to exhibit in Puerto Rico and are ignored by Puerto Rican collectors who focus on island-produced work or on internationally known artists. So where does this leave us? Value in art is a cultural, social, historical, and political product. It emerges from institutional spaces, museum, art schools, art critics, that support artists, creates audiences, and shapes tastes and fuels collectors. And more, the market is a central component of these processes of evaluation. White artists have long enjoyed access to these spaces, and in the past decades, the emerging category of Latin American art has been doing the same for Latin American artists. And here it's important to know that the category of Latin American art is as much of a construct than Latino art, or the dominant construction of American art. The issue is that some of these categories are institutionalized and thus accepted, and others are not. In particular, Latinx art is seen as tercera categoría. You think of the Bronx, you think of the lady who cleans your house. You don't think of any acceptable reference for art. Granted, we all know examples of few Latino artists that have made it in the contemporary art world, but these are exceptions and not the norm. And their success has often come with a price. The background is often lessened, denied, or explained away. Whiteness remains the price they either have to pay or is imposed on them. And a wrinkle here is some Afro-Latino artists who may be tied into African American art networks, which evidence the kind of black and white binary thinking in the art world as it places or ignores Latinx art. I don't see any easy way out of this impasse, but I know full well that denying Latinx art and embracing an imaginary white art market where identity, race, gender, and background remain unaccounted for is not the answer. Post-racialism and colorblindness have never been the answer to battle racist thinking, and this is the big lesson of the Black Lives Matter movement, that self-love, decolonizing our minds, is a necessary step forwards towards the cultural revolution involving any anti-racist movement. In this spirit, I call Latinx artists to embrace ourselves and each other in all of our diversity and complexity, and our artistic and community to stop tiptoeing around race, to decolonize our minds from our classist and racist thinking that makes us believe that Latinidad and our history and communities are unworthy spaces for artistic intervention. Maybe 50 years from now, we will not need identity placeholders to claim a space at the table, but we're not there yet. And we have a lot of work to do and too many voices to fill in the Latinx part of our American art history. Thank you.